BDEW-Kongress 2014. Podcast. Energy Markets in the 21st Century. What can Germany and the United States learn from each other? Jeff R. Immelt, Chairman of the Board and CEO, General Electric, Fairfield, Vereinigte Staaten.
Thank you. Ewald, even though I don't speak German, I did hear a few naughty words in there. So, listen, the one thing I'm not going to talk about today is probably the thing you would most want me to talk about today. So let me maybe start that as a preface. And that, of course, is the U.S.-German football match tomorrow. So, but I'll accept what Johann said to be the gospel and kind of take it from there. I have to admit, I'm much more of an American football fan than I am a soccer fan. I have to confess that with my European team. One time I was doing an employee meeting in India, and somebody asked me, what's the hardest thing about leading a global company? And I said, it's pretending to give a damn about soccer. That's the hardest thing. So I confess that at the beginning today as a true confession. You know, I've been given a topic today that's quite hard, and that is to try to play judge to U.S. in Germany energy policy. So I'm going to leave that to the end and maybe just talk about perspectives on the global energy mix. And I can echo much of what Helga and Johann said earlier. Energy is a business that goes back to the foundation of General Electric. We were founded by Thomas Edison. We've been in the power generation market for more than a century. Today, we, across our oil and gas business, and our power generation business, and our energy management business, have a broad and deep footprint across the world. We sell power products in more than 170 countries around the world, so I have a perspective maybe that could be helpful in this room to give you a sense of what the rest of the world thinks, in addition to maybe what we think is possible and can happen in Europe. So that's the context with which I come in here today. The last thing I would say that's quite optimistic is to say that this remains one of the core infrastructure markets around the world, that growth is still possible, that a third of the world's population lives without electricity today, and that in many ways this is going to be a growth industry and it's going to be a volatile industry for a long time. So I come here with optimism and promise for the industry, but it's not without change. I'm going to make 4 points today to give you a perspective of how I would view this subject and maybe what would be useful to such a great group and such a broad group in the room today. First, the reason why energy is so hard is it is a combination of both energy and policy. But we always have to keep in mind the industrial context for development in the energy sector. So the concerns are in the environment, the concerns are the cost of electricity, the concerns are job creation, and the concerns are security. And all of those 4 big concerns have to be kept in front of us as we approach how to develop good energy policy. I was a member of what was called the U.S. Climate Action Partnership in the United States. This was a consortium of companies that advocated cap and trade in the United States. And this effort died in a second when the financial crisis hit. So people and consumers always transform themselves and through economic cycles to go back to the hierarchy of needs. And we can never forget that as we develop energy policy around the world. GE, for the last decade, has driven an initiative called Ecomagination. And at the foundation of Ecomagination in 2004 was that through innovation, we could lower costs and improve the environment at the same time. Through innovation, through technology, through scale, we could lower the cost of electricity, we could improve the environment, we could create economic development at the same time. When we started, we had roughly $5 billion of revenue in what we called Ecomagination products. Today, it's close to $30 billion. So it hasn't been perfect, but I would say that there is a case to be made that in the world of energy, technology innovation can be a big solution provider, and it can do that in the context of also having policy. So when you forget economics, every time as a company we got too green, we got too precious. We fell out of favor with our customers, we fell out of favor even with consumers, and every time we got too far away of the environmental impact, we weren't effective either. But it's the right balance between economics, environmental policy, security, and job creation, which is ultimately what's going to determine successful energy policy. So eco-imagination is a statement that innovation can drive great performance and change at the same time. So while we're setting policy, don't get too far away from what industrialization really means and how to drive economics. That's point number one. Point number two, in the last decade, there have been seismic changes in this industry. In other words, this is a slow-moving, 10 years is a moment in time in the global energy industry. We're selling frequently assets that are going to last 30 or 40 years, but in the last decade, there have been things that no one predicted and that have changed the landscape of the energy industry forever. And I would just point out a few of them. The first one is the role of China. China is the incremental consumer in energy today. We talk about China going in gas consumption and power generation from 5% to 10%. And you sit there and say, hey, 5 to 10%, who cares? It's not, you know, small. That's like 10 or 15 gigawatts of new capacity every year. So in the end, it's not about us in the US, and it's not really about us here in this room in terms of where some of the decisions will be made. But China, in every way, is the incremental customer in the power generation sector and will drive and lead in technology and standards and change. So they have to be an important player in the world today in energy policy in ways they haven't been in the past. Age of gas. Natural gas is plentiful in the United States. Natural gas is plentiful everywhere. There's been more gas found in the last decade than we could have imagined. No one would have envisioned the unconventional shale gas play in the United States, but between offshore gas and shale gas and new gas being found, it really has fundamentally changed the cost curve of gas versus oil and of gas versus other developments. And this is going to drive tremendous change, I think, in the footprint of energy around the world. If I was leading the US Chamber of Commerce and there were a group of German CEOs in Washington, D.C., that I wanted to make my best sales pitch as to why to invest in the United States, number one is cost of electricity. Now, I'm a friend, I'm with you today. I'm a friend here today. But I'm giving you a hypothetical to say that is the way someone in the United States feels about this incredible gift that's been given to them called natural gas. And a steel mill in Texas is going to pay 4 cents a kilowatt hour for electricity, and that's quite competitive. So point number two is age of gas is a game changer as it pertains to global economics. Another change that's been amazing in the last decade is the cost of renewables. So at the same time gas has found this foundation out there in the world, renewables have had a similar platform, and I have to give the Europeans, I have to give Germany, I have to give the EU a ton of credit along with China for how that's worked. So renewables, we entered the wind business in 2002. The cost of electricity was close to 30 cents a kilowatt hour. Today, there's electricity being bid in projects in Colorado at 4 cents a kilowatt hour. So you have a transformative change in the cost of renewables. The same is true with solar, going from maybe 30 cents to 10 cents. So the renewable landscape is vastly different today than it was a decade ago, and that is phenomenal. And I think the last big change that's happened last decade is no one could have ever envisioned the decentralization that's taken place around the world versus a central power scheme of what we faced in the world today. The transformation that Johan's taking E.ON through is the same transformation that utilities in the United States and around the world, they're just maybe 5 or 10 years behind that. But a strong decentralization in the power grid and power performance and power generation is a big global theme. So when you think about what's happened in the last decade, between natural gas, between solar, between the role of China, between centralization versus decentralization, I think that argues for everybody in this room that diversity in fuels has to be part of our strategy. Because none of us in this room predicted what happened the last 10 years, which means none of us, believe me, GE is firmly invested through GE Capital and GE in natural gas. I can't show you one proposal from 2002 that had gas at $3 a million BTU, not one. I can't show you one of our recommendations that said wind could get down to 5 or 6 cents, yet they did. So the lesson from the past, I think, would argue for diversification, focus on innovation, and making sure that you don't close any door in terms of the way that the future looks. We are in the nuclear business. As a business proposition, the nuclear business has been very difficult for 40 years. But as CEO of GE, we remain determined, because someday we don't want to be exiting that business or de-emphasizing that business when the future might include a stronger nuclear renaissance as part of that mix. So that's what we've learned from the last 10 years. Point number 3, there's not one country in the world that likes their energy policy. So if it makes you feel any better, every place I go, I was in China 2 weeks ago, I live in the United States, the unhappiness is universal. So congratulations, you fit right in the rest of the world on that regard. And the moderator asked Johan and Helga, 2 of the smartest people I know in this industry, what they would do if they could wave a magic wand and decide how do you match the politics with the reality of the day. And some of the things that we would advocate for, but certainly we would advocate for the same thing around the world, is the first thing is the subsidies pervert markets, and they should be changed and transformed looking forward. In other words, I think looking at subsidies looking backward, you never want to enter into that realm. It creates a lack of trust in the financial system. But looking forward, I think you can say these subsidies need to be changed, transformed. The ones that are supporting, look, if you're talking subsidies that are 20 years old or 10 years old that are subsidizing 20-year-old technology, that's no longer an incentive for innovation. Industry shouldn't ask, and government shouldn't propose that those subsidies don't get in some way wound down or de-emphasized over time. I would say that. I would also say, as somebody that sees the full breadth of an energy project, the vast majority of the money that was taken out of any of these projects in the United States or Europe over the past 10 or 20 years have been in project finance, not technical innovation. So never forget the context in which you're going. So these subsidies have to be changed. The production tax credit in the United States has to be transformed. The feed-in tariffs and things like that have to be transformed. That has to happen now. I can't emphasize more the need for a common standard, a vision for 2030, a vision for 2020, give industry a chance to innovate around it and make it broad. We far prefer a clean energy standard versus picking winners and losers technically. Set a goal, set a time frame, let the world innovate around it. That's going to do a better job of driving innovation than picking winners and losers as you go forward in technology. So clean energy standards we would argue for. Open markets, open systems. You know, in the US, basically energy policy gets set by the EPA and by 50 states. So the notion of having one national energy grid is still a big challenge here. Again, the dream would be having a common European electricity market. It would make everybody's life easier. It would make the system lower cost. I think the odds of that happening are extraordinarily low. So I think you would agree with that. But we should keep that in the back of our mind as being a way to drive better cost performance and better flexibility as time goes on. And again, I would echo what our panelists said, is that, that there just shouldn't be free riders in the system. And that ultimately people should have to pay for security. People should have to pay for the ways to get onto the grid. And just, again, by helping somebody at the cost of another ultimately is not going to make consumers any better off in this process. And if I asked for what a good regulation would be, it would have a vision of restructuring the subsidies, finding a way to give us a standard to shoot for that's aspirational. It can be high, but it should be aspirational, but it should be a common standard and one that different technologies could meet. We should focus on a single market, and we should drive more flexible systems where security is recognized and people pay for. And if we could have a policy like that, that's important. Europe has its own issues. US has issues. China has big problems of ways to clean up the environment and do it in a way that drives innovation technology without driving electricity costs too high. So the big markets around the world are all facing in those policy changes. So energy depends on all of the factors of security, environment, innovation, cost, job creation, we can solve all of them, but we need to have an industrial context. Believe that the last 10 years have been seismic changes, and that could be changes. That argues for diversity and innovation. And I believe that if we can just make incremental steps towards a policy that makes more sense, with subsidies, with open markets, and with clear standards, both in the US and Europe, we'll be further ahead than we are today. The last point I would make is just give you a few ideas that innovation is ongoing. Companies like GE and others are investing as much in R&D in the energy sector today as we ever have before. And I thought I'd give you just a glimpse in some of the areas that I think looking forward 10 years could help shape the energy sector and what could be really interesting and important as we look forward. First, again, I hate to sound like a broken record, but I would take you to China. China is going to invest across multiple different fuels. They're going to keep investing in coal. They're going to try to bring gas to China, shale gas to China, and they'll be the biggest in the world in photovoltaics and wind by far. And so if you think diversity is going to be de-emphasized because of what we're doing here in Europe and the United States, that's not true. So China will continue to go down a path that's going to develop a broad swath of energy technologies, and that's important. I think tremendous investment has to go in the grid, both storage and making grids smarter and more robust. And when I talk about storage, I'm not trying to kind of solve all the world's problems. I'm trying to get 15 minutes of storage that can help during times of volatility that helps smooth out the system. So we're trying to take a step in storage and put it in concert with other technologies around the grid, making it bigger and smarter, more interactive, giving more information. But we believe that just like in the past, grid technology was maybe underinvested in over the past 10 or 20 years, the next 10 or 20 years, there's going to be a more substantial focus on storage, balance of plant, and grid. You know, in the case of solar technology, inverters, ways to manage the load are incredibly important and ways to think about the future. Transporting gas. In a continent like China, or in a continent like Africa, there's a 100 gigawatt deficit of electricity, and it's surrounded by enough gas to solve all of its problems. So the ability to bring gas to gas-starved regions like Africa, again, is going to drive demand. It's going to drive technical innovation, and this whole process of gas to power, getting pipeline structures in place, driving distributed power, finding ways to get gas to places like Europe from unconventional ways and unconventional sources is going to be going on around the world in a really substantial way. Decentralization, just like it's gone over the past 20 years from central plants to distributed plants, I would bet that in the next 10 years it's going to go to the consumer. So you're going to see in the next decade or 20 years an empowered consumer where companies like Google are in the energy business, media companies are in the energy business, telecommunications companies are in the energy business, and the invasion in the home to give the consumer more voice and decentralization taking the next step. I would bet a ton that is going to get more interplay and more strength. And lastly, just the notion of data and analytics is really going to be a big driver in the context of big infrastructure industries around the world. So GE has invested massively, and you know, our belief is that every industrial company is going to be an analytics company in the 21st century. And the ability to use performance data to manage the grid, to manage how power generation assets operate, and how things get used and stored is going to drive tremendous strength. We sell wind turbines right now that have control-based monitoring, where the controls and sensors can pick up wind direction changes from 50 miles away from the wind turbine. It can change the angle of the blade to get more sweep. It can have more uptime and more wind availability, and it can automatically pick up when intermittency might take place. So that's all in front of us. This is not technology that has to be invented. This is technology that has to be commercialized and can ultimately be successful. So I think a lot of the technology in the next decade is going to revolve around all the things I talked about in the past, plus grid, plus gas to power, decentralization, into the consumer home, into the home, and with analytics. And there's a ton of innovation that's going on right now to help accomplish that. So, energy has to be driven industrially. It can't just be public policy. Economic cycles, cost matter, as does reduction and improvement in climate. As GE, we think climate science is real. We believe that innovation has to cure it. So this is not a question about the science. This is just a question of how best to make progress and move it forward. We believe that the last 10 years is a good test case to say that there's going to be radical change, and there can be radical change driven by innovation. We think that the same policy steps that are needed in the United States are needed in Europe, which are subsidy reform, transparency to goals, open markets, connected markets, and pay for security, right? And then the innovation of the future is going to be much more about the grid and the balance of plant, not just on the power generation side. So what can Germany learn from the United States? Coming back to my assigned topic for today, I would say the argument is a lot. I think in many ways we're going at the problem from a different paradigm. The U.S. is going to drive it from, I would say, a gas and renewables standpoint primarily. Europe is so vested in renewables. Renewables have to be incredibly important, and adding to that a baseload capability, my sense is maybe some of the countries will build nuclear, but maybe gas should have a more important role. So maybe a decade from now, we'll look like the mirror of each other between gas and renewables, and much more investment around the grid, I would say, as a public policy in terms of where we go. And on Energiewende, you know, I think the government should do what business people do, right? And that is, we always call something the same thing, but we change it every day. So we don't worry about rebranding anything. We just said, look, it all worked. We just can make it better. And let's not go through the trouble of changing the name. Let's just keep it the same name, but make evolutionary change and continue to drive it, because this sense of innovation and strength and capability and change is very much a part of what now is in Germany. And this system can be made better and more effective, but there's elements of this system you have today that are actually quite good and quite strong. So those are my comments about the world of energy today. I appreciate your support and the support for our team. GE is investing in Germany and has been a long-term player here, and I hope we can earn more of your business. So thank you very much.
Weitere Informationen und Podcasts unter bdew.de/Kongress.